It was Ronald Reagan that said, quote, "There's only one guaranteed way you can have peace, and you can have it in the next second: surrender." Is that what is being talked about in Saudi Arabia between the United States and Russia? A Ukrainian surrender just for peace? Well, in Saudi Arabia, there is a high stakes diplomatic meeting unfolding between senior officials from the United States and Russia, marking a shift in international efforts to resolve the ongoing war in Ukraine. This engagement took place behind closed doors, with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio leading the American delegation, while Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov represented Moscow. The meeting, which excluded both Ukraine and European allies, has sparked widespread controversy and speculation about its potential implications. The groundwork for these talks was laid just 6 days prior, when Trump spoke with Putin in a lengthy phone conversation. Trump has claimed he is the only leader capable of negotiating a ceasefire and insists that a fair and lasting resolution is within reach, provided that all parties involved find the terms acceptable. Yet Ukraine, the country at the center of the war here, was left completely out of the initial discussions, fueling concerns that decisions are being made without Kyiv's direct participation. Marco Rubio said, quote, "One meeting isn't going to solve it. We're going to need to have vibrant diplomatic missions that are able to function normally in order to be able to continue these conduits. We're going to appoint a high-level team from our end to help negotiate and work through the end of the conflict in Ukraine in a way that's enduring and acceptable to all parties engaged," end quote. U.S. State Department spokesperson Tammy Bruce said, quote, "The U.S. and Russian delegations had agreed to establish a consultation mechanism to address irritants in our bilateral relationship," end quote. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said, quote, "I think the conversation was very useful. We not only listened, but also heard each other," end quote. Lavrov also indicated that if Ukraine joined NATO, it would pose a direct threat to Russian sovereignty. U.S. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz said, quote, "This should be a permanent end to the war and not a temporary one, as it was in the past. We are absolutely talking to both sides," end quote. For Russia, the meeting represented a significant diplomatic breakthrough after years of being isolated by Western sanctions and international condemnation. Just having the meeting in a bilateral forum with the United States at a neutral site is a win for Russia. They will leverage it as two superpowers having a discussion, excluding the insignificant minor players in Ukraine and Europe. They will be seen as equals in the Russian eyes, which they are not by a vast majority of metrics, but that is what Russia is seeing. This is something Rubio knows, but is likely handcuffed by his boss. Lavrov and Kremlin foreign policy aide Yuri Ushakov arrived in Saudi Arabia prepared to push for economic concessions and a relaxation of sanctions that have crippled Russia's access to Western markets. Kirill Dmitriev, head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, emphasized that American businesses have lost over $300 billion by leaving the Russian market. Now, this is only partially true, as the U.S. has actually made close to $250 billion of that by being the primary supplier of commodities for many of those countries that have sanctioned Russia and is not doing business with them. From the American side, Rubio and his team entered the discussions with a transactional approach, reflecting President Trump's longstanding skepticism of U.S. involvement in Ukraine. The talks focused on establishing a framework for future negotiations, including the appointment of high-level teams tasked with developing a roadmap for ending the war. Additionally, there was an agreement on the need to restaff diplomatic missions in Moscow and Washington, which is a crucial step towards restoring direct diplomatic engagement. Now, it's worth noting, up until his apparent move into the Trump administration, Rubio was a staunch advocate for providing aid to Ukraine. And despite these developments, the exclusion of Ukraine and European allies has provoked strong reactions. President Zelensky dismissed the negotiations as illegitimate, declaring that his country would not accept any deal made without its input. European leaders, including President Macron of France and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, have underscored the necessity of robust security guarantees for Ukraine, warning that any agreement reached without European involvement risks legitimizing Russia's aggression and setting a dangerous precedent. Russia, for its part, remains firm on its stance against a NATO presence in Ukraine, no matter what they are calling it. This is a nod to the discussions that the EU may want to put peacekeepers in Ukraine if there's a ceasefire. Lavrov reiterated Moscow's position that any peace agreement must include the abandonment of NATO's 2008 promise of future Ukrainian membership. This promise, if agreed to, would undo decades of previous precedent where NATO membership is an open-door policy. We don't just restrict members because of potential threats from enemies. Meanwhile, European nations are scrambling to formulate their own unified response, with some countries even considering deploying those peacekeepers that Lavrov alluded to. Yet the question remains, what does this actually mean for Ukraine and the broader international order? Comparisons have been drawn to Trump's 2020 Doha agreement with the Taliban, a deal that ultimately facilitated America's withdrawal from Afghanistan without direct involvement from its allies and was a critical failure in execution from both the Trump and Biden administrations. In a previous video, I discussed the historical folly of larger nations deciding the fate of smaller nations in war. Critics fear that history may be repeating itself, with Trump once again prioritizing an expedited deal over a long-term strategic peace. As concerns mount over what signals this sends to other global powers, including China, the stakes in these negotiations extend far beyond Ukraine. For now, no immediate resolutions have been reached, and the process of diplomatic engagement is only beginning. While Russia welcomes the opportunity to reestablish economic ties, lift sanctions, and be seen as equals with the United States, European leaders are bracing for the possibility that Trump may strike a deal that fundamentally reshapes the security landscape of the continent. Ukraine, who is resolute in its fight for sovereignty, insists no matter what, it will not accept a dictated peace.